You might be forgiven for being surprised to learn there are limits on how much football clubs can spend. Although you might wonder how effective the fair finance rules are when top earners can take home £300,000 a week. Yes, a week. But at the other end of the scale, non-league players are lucky if they get an orange slice at half-time. Yet UEFA has created a set of rules to try to stop reckless spending and prevent clubs building up suicidal levels of debt. And they face hefty penalties if they ignore them. And the same bulging chequebook that secured Manchester City the Premiership is set to land them in just this kind of trouble. Here's Chris Cook.
A lot of kids right now will be dreaming of playing for Manchester City. They look likely to win the league. But it's not all Roy of the Rovers stuff for them. City faces a £50 million fine and restriction to the number of players it can use in European competition. That's because UEFA, the European football body, thinks City may have breached its financial fair play rules. These are rules that aim to prevent clubs from collapsing because they've spent a lot more than they make. Many football fans really like the idea of these financial fair play rules. That's because a lot of supporters are quite suspicious of the role of big money in football. They don't like the idea that you just need to find some oligarch or some foreign princeling to back your team and then you can walk your way to the Premier League title. That's why clubs like AFC Wimbledon, which is fan-owned, have a lot of sympathy and support from fans of other teams. Man City's owner, Sheikh Mansour from Abu Dhabi, has certainly poured money into the club. This season alone, despite starting with a team that finished strongly last year, they spent £95 million on transfers. Crystal Palace, by contrast, who play in the same league, spent only £24 million. Now, big spending alone isn't the problem, it's spending a lot more than you make. The rules say that a club can only spend €45 million more on its day-to-day running costs than it gets in ticket receipts and commercial sponsorship deals, that sort of thing. So UEFA has to find out how much they're spending and how much money they're getting. The real problem they've got is that while it's pretty easy to work out how much a football club is actually spending, it's actually very difficult to work out exactly how much money it's earning. So if a club just spent €45 million more than they really earned over a 2-year period and then they got their owner to just bail them out, UEFA would tackle that kind of behaviour. But what if that club owner knew a guy who owed them a favour who could put the money in for them? That might swerve around the rules. Now, UEFA is worried by this. It calls it a related party transaction. That's why City are in trouble. The club thinks that its overspend over the past 2 years is below €45 million, or £37 million. But those numbers rest on a big sponsorship deal, worth about £40 million a year, with Etihad, the Abu Dhabi airline headed by Sheikh Mansour's half-brother. UEFA will want to know whether City got an unusually good deal.
It has to be rad.
UEFA can also show teams a red card, banning them from European competitions altogether. But it will hope that fines, which effectively cut clubs' financial fair play limits in future years, will do.
I think what UEFA are hoping to do is to get compliance by agreement, by settlement, and therefore the harsher sanctions of points deduction or actually removing clubs from the competition, I can't see happening in the short term.
We're not booking buses for a new celebration in the coming weeks. City is in negotiation with UEFA about these issues. So too is Paris Saint-Germain, which is backed by Qatar. So we're in the slightly peculiar position that a rulebook that was designed to stop clubs from going bust is now catching out the clubs who have the most solvent backing of all.
Well, with us is Mark Palios, who's the former chief executive of the FA, and in Salford, Professor Tom Cannon, who's an expert in sport finance. Mark, firstly to you, it looks like the first fines are going to be applied here, but with a bit of financial jiggery-pokery around the edges, are these rules really working as they were designed to?
Well, I think the very fact that we're having a debate is, to me,
it's the proof of the pudding. We're starting a debate. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you weren't having this debate. I think that's an important point to make. And I think you also have to distinguish between UEFA's rules at the top end of the game and also the other rules that have been copied, if you like, in the Premier League and further down the leagues. And down the leagues, it's having an effect. And that's where you really have to look at protecting clubs against financial problems. At the top end, I think it's more about creating a level playing field.
But can you create a level playing field? Because you're still going to get clubs like Man City, PSG, with the deepest pockets almost in the world, just piling cash in. Yeah, it's not really going to make that much difference, is it?
Unless you stand back and get to looking at sport and saying sport is a special case, at the heart of professional sport, at the heart of sport as a business and as a sport, you have this conflict. In any other business, you kill off your competitors. In sport, you have to maintain that competitive playing field.
Well, Professor Tom Cannon, was this a problem that really needed to be solved in your view?
Well, the evidence is that it didn't need to be solved, because if you look at the top of the English Premiership, you've got 3 clubs in the top 5 who are not owned by super rich Middle Eastern oligarchs, nor is it true in Europe. If you look at the Champions League, one of the teams in the Champions League final is clearly not in terms of Atletico Madrid like that. And the whole issue of financial fair play is based on a false premise, which is that it is in some way less fair to have a foreign investor or an investor putting money in than having the situation which you have in Spain, where the distribution of income is such that actually the team at the bottom of the Spanish First Division gets virtually nothing, and the team at the top, whether it's Real Madrid or Barcelona, scoop the pool. If Manchester City got the share of income that Real Madrid or Barcelona get at the English TV income, they'd have had an extra £50 million a year for the last 3 years and not be in trouble at all. So the whole premise is false.
Well, Mark Palios, when you listen to Tom's numbers there, it sounds like actually this didn't even need to happen, because that equation between money in and rewards out isn't as simple as you suggest.
I think what you do is have to stand back and look at this, because you're looking at Man City at a particular point in time, you're looking at other clubs at a particular point in time. And unless you take a broader view, I think you will come to a specific conclusion that supports your case. So take, for example, Arsenal, who now complain that Man City should be punished in terms of, or certainly Arsene Wenger does. But actually, when you look at it, it's a function of timing. Yes, Arsenal run their ship in a much more business-like way, you would say, rather than the benefactor model that Manchester City's got. But they're there already, and therefore they're pulling up the drawbridge if you apply these rules too harshly.
Professor Cannon, are you saying, though, there's not a problem with money and football?
I don't think there is the problem that UEFA first posited. It's not the problem, because if you look at the German league, for example, last year the Champions League was dominated by German clubs, and in a European level they are, in a sense, an ideal model. They're owned by the fans. They created and posited a problem. Originally, don't forget, they originally talked about the problem being debt, and actually the most indebted club in England actually is hardly being touched, whether they were in the Champions League or not. They're not touched by this. And then the comparison between City, for example, and PSG is even more absurd. City actually have got a very good sponsorship deal, which is justified by the massive developments taking place at the Etihad. You're getting the redevelopment of one of the most deprived areas of Greater Manchester on the back of the Etihad campus development. Comparing that, for example, with what's happening at PSG is nonsense. So to see City penalised to the same degree as PSG is absurd, because you've got very different scenarios and very different strategies for the two clubs. It's a completely false situation being created.
So Professor Cannon's not too impressed by UEFA's grasp on the figures, clearly, but isn't it at root the wages of footballers that really get people's goat? Briefly.
Yeah, again, stepping back to this, you know, the rotting rhinoceros on the table is players' wages are too high. If you actually, if a kid was going to get £1 million a year, would he bother to play football? Yes, he would. If he's getting 5 million, would it make any difference to him? Probably doesn't.
Okay.
And where would that extra cash go?
Okay, Professor Tom Cannon in Salford and Mark Palios here in the studio. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.